In this session, we explore the iframe element, sort of a picture within a picture feature. This allows you to have multiple pages showing all at the same time in a single container page. Wow! Let's have a look. The iframe element. Its purpose is to define a self-contained, nested browsing context, an inline frame. Syntax: start tag iframe with some attributes, and end iframe. Start tag and the end tag are both required, but there is no content. Attributes in addition to the global attributes: source equals. This is the URL of the content to identify what is to be displayed. Name equals is the name of the browsing context for reference when you're linking to it, and we'll have an example a little later on. Width equals the width of the frame in pixels. Height equals the height of the frame in pixels. Note there are others, but not discussed here. Events to plan for: none. While an iframe can contain an item such as an image, it most usually contains an entire page. But there are some restrictions. The frame size is the default chosen by the browser, unless you specify height and/or width. In my testing, all the browsers I tested gave pretty much the same frame size. If the content does not fit in the frame, the browser will provide scroll bars. The frame cannot be moved on the page by the user, that is, you can't drag it. The frame cannot be resized directly by the user. Some browser controls and commands, such as print, for example, will apply to the owning page, the parent page, but not to the iframe. Elements in the nested browsing context are not available to scripts in the parent browsing context, although the frame itself can be manipulated using DOM methods. Let's go through some examples to make this explicit. Example 1, arbitrary insertion of an iframe. In our dateroom.html report, I slipped in an arbitrary iframe pointing at our table HTML that created a graph. Here's the relevant HTML. So notice the iframe source equals tables underscore for graphs.html, and then here's how it displays. So this frame just pops up in the middle of our report, and notice the scroll bars because the default size wasn't quite wide enough and tall enough to hold the entire content. Example 2, a slideshow. We can have controls outside the iframe change the contents of the iframe. So here's our code. We have our head, title, style, script. Var curpic equals 0, var my frame. And we have an array, var picklist, picklist 0, 1, and 2, which are old friends conference A, conference B, conference C.jpg. And we have a function nextPick and a function prefpick. And in nextPick, we take the value of current pick and increment it, and we ask if that's 3, then set it to 0. And then myFrame equals document.getElementById show, and myFrame.source equals picklist bracket curpick. So I grabbed the current frame, put it into a variable, and then changed the source attribute. The function prefpick is very similar, except I start out with decreasing current pick, and if it's -1, then I set it back to 2. So we cycle between 0, 1, and 2. Now here's the actual body. H1 class equals into basic slideshow. Click the button to advance to the next picture or back up to the previous picture. iframe source equals conf_a.jpg, id equals show. So we're going to start with conference room A, and we have given it an ID so that we can reference it in our document.getElementById code. And then a couple of buttons. 1 type equals button value equals next, and on click we invoke the next pick function, and another button value equals prev, and on click we invoke the prev pick function. Note again the ID equals show in the iframe and the reference to it in the document.getElementById in the functions. So the code is referencing the source attribute of the iframe. And here's a short demo of the result. Here we see how the page shows up, and we click on the slideshow next, going through the pictures, and then previous, going through the pictures. Example 3, change iframe dimensions dynamically. In this example, our iframe element has the height and width attributes specified explicitly. Then our functions change these attributes dynamically. Some points about using height and width. If you specify just one of these, the browser will calculate the other to stay in proportion. If the resource mentioned in the source equal attribute has an intrinsic height and intrinsic width, then let target ratio equal intrinsic width divided by intrinsic height. Now, if both height and width are specified, then one of these statements must be true. I'm not going to read them out to you. You can see them. They basically says that the specified width and height ratio must be reasonably close to the target ratio. This prevents or minimizes distortion. Note that specifying the width and/or height impacts the size of the frame. It will not stretch the contents of the frame. With that in mind, here's our code for this example. The head and the title and the style, pretty much the usual. Script, var myFrame, and we have two functions, larger and smaller. In larger, into myFrame I put document.getElementById parenthesis show. In other words, I get the frame element into that variable. And then I change the height and the width. Notice the myFrame.height is myFrame.height times 1.5, and myFrame.width is myFrame.width times 1.5, so I stretch them by 50%. Function smaller, on the other hand, same idea, but the height and width are multiplied by 0.85, so it makes them smaller. Now in the body, I have h1 class equals in2, change iframe size from outside the iframe itself. Click the buttons to change the size of the frame. Now iframe source equals conf_a.jpg, id equals show, height equals 200, width equals 250, end iframe. And then two buttons, one value larger that invokes the larger function when it's clicked, the other with a value smaller that invokes the smaller function when it's clicked. So here's a short demo of the result. Here's our frame with the specified height and width, and as we click on larger, the frame grows, and smaller, it shrinks. Note that it is the frame dimensions that are changed, not the contents dimensions. This will not stretch or shrink the contents. Example 4. Multiple iframes on the screen. Here's a simple example of how to display multiple iframes on a screen. Really very basic and simple. Head, title, style. Notice the show 1, show 2, show 3 with the hashtag in front of them. That's how you specify style for a particular ID. Then in our body, h1 class equals in2, multiple iframes cascaded on the screen, and then iframe source equals conference_a.jpg, id equals show 1, and then a thin line, and then iframe source equal conf_b.jpg, id equals show 2, and then another thin line for spacing, and iframe source equals conf_c.jpg, id equals show 3. That's all. And this code displays this way. Example 5. Changing the content of an iframe. In this example, we change the content of an iframe by linking into the iframe using the name equals attribute in the iframe and the target equals attribute in the parent page. So here's our code. Nothing unusual in the head, and the body has an h1, class equals in2, replacing content in an iframe from the parent page. And then here's our iframe. Source equal conf underscore a.jpg, name equals show, and iframe. Clicking on A, href equal unireport2.html, target equals show, this link, and A, will put a report inside the frame. No script required. Notice here our first use of the name equals attribute in an iframe. And here's a short demo of the result. Here's our frame with the conference room A as the content, and I click on the link and it goes and gets that page and sends it into the frame. Pretty cool. Finally, I put together a page of 16 frames, some from our solutions, some from media files. So the page is just 16 frames. Here's a screenshot. This really can't do this page justice in a screenshot, though. You need to see it in video. In this session, we discussed and described the iframe element and demonstrated some uses for it. I'm sure you can find even more uses for this tremendous tool. Coming up, the next lesson is the last lesson in this course. We will be simply tying up some loose ends and suggesting further studies. See you there.